Welcome, weary travelers of the night, to a journey through the shadowed alleys of medieval Europe, where the chains of slavery clinked louder than any cathedral bell. If stress has stolen your sleep, let's trade it for a tale that's both haunting and strangely soothing. Picture this. You're curled up, lights dimmed, maybe a fan humming softly like a distant lullaby. Before we dive in, give this video a gentle, like if you're curious, subscribe to keep these bedtime stories coming, and drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from, and what's the clock saying? Tonight, we're not chasing knights or kings, but slipping into the worn shoes of a medieval slave, their world raw and unyielding. Its history whispered with a smirk, dark yet oddly comforting. So settle in, let the night embrace you, and let's unravel a past that's as gripping as it is grim. The world greets you with the stink of manure and the scratch of straw against your newborn skin, a cradle not of love, but of necessity, tucked in the corner of a medieval stable. You're a slave, born to slaves, your existence as unremarkable to the Lord's estate as the oxen snuffling nearby. No parchment records your name, no family crest claims you and your birthday. It's just another dawn, lost in the churn of feudal life. Your parents, shadows bent under the weight of their own chains, can't offer you dreams, only the hard truth that survival is your inheritance. By the time you're 5, your tiny hands grip buckets heavier than your hopes, and you're already learning the language of your master's face. A scowl means hunger, a nod, a fleeting rest. Freedom? You don't know the word, and nobody bothers to teach it. This is medieval Europe, not the tapestry of knights and castles peddled in fairy tales, but a gritty machine where your life fuels someone else's glory. The year might be 1050 or 1200. It doesn't matter. Time is a luxury you don't own. Your world is the estate, a sprawl of mud, stone, and endless toil under a sky that's always gray, as if even the sun's too stingy to shine for you. You grow up among the animals, their warm stench your only comfort, their simple needs a mirror to your own. You don't cry for a mother's touch. You learn to dodge the overseer's stick instead. It's not cruelty. It's just the order of things, as natural as the seasons to those who hold the whip. Imagine waking each day to the same truth. You're not a person, but a tool, no different from the plow rusting in the shed. Your first memory isn't a lullaby, but the creak of a barn door, the low grunt of pigs, and the sharp tang of hay dust in your nose. You're taught to move before you're taught to speak, to carry before you can count. By 7, you're hauling water from a well so deep it seems to mock your smallness, your arms trembling not from the effort, but from the bone-deep chill of the morning. You don't ask why. This is your forever, a sentence handed down before you drew breath. And yet, there's a stubborn spark in you, not of rebellion, but of survival, that keeps your feet shuffling forward. Here's the shock of it. Nobody sees you as human, not even you. The Lord, perched in his stone hall, doesn't know your face. To him, you're a number scratched in a ledger, if you're lucky enough to be counted at all. The free peasants, trudging past with their own burdens, spare you no glance. Your existence is a reminder of how close they skate to your fate. Even the priest, droning sermons about divine order, looks through you like you're part of the pews. You learn to read the master's mood, not out of loyalty, but because it's the difference between a scrap of bread and a night of gnawing hunger. His frown is a storm cloud. His fleeting smile is a rare sunbeam. You're not his child, not even his servant. just a shadow that keeps his fields alive. Let's pause on that for a moment. Today, we fret over missed emails or cold coffee, but you're decoding a man's fleeting glance to survive another day. It's not just labor, it's a game of instinct, played before you knew what instinct meant. You're barely tall enough to reach the well's rope, yet you're already a master of this grim art. There's no school, no books, no gentle hand to guide you, only the rhythm of work and the weight of expectation. You don't dream of escape, because where would you go? The forest is a maze of wolves and bandits. The village is a trap of suspicious eyes. Your world ends at the estate's edge, and beyond it lies only whispers of worse fates. Compare that to now, where we scroll through endless choices, jobs, homes, lives, yet still feel trapped by smaller cages. Your medieval self had no such illusions. You didn't choose this life, but you endure it, not with grand heroics, but with the quiet grit of someone who knows stopping isn't an option. There's no word for resilience in your tongue, but you live it, breath by labored breath. You're not taught to read or write, but you learn to read the wind, the soil, the master's temper. It's a knowledge deeper than books, carved into your calluses, a testament to a strength we modern folk might envy, even if we'd never trade places. Back to your childhood, or what passes for it. By 8, you're no longer a child if you ever were. You're a worker, your small frame bent to tasks that would break a grown man's spirit. You carry firewood until your shoulders scream, sweep stables until your hands bleed, and still, you're expected to move faster. The overseer's voice is a lash, his stick quicker than his words. You don't hate him. He's as much a cog in this machine as you are. You learn to flinch less, to work through the pain, to swallow the hunger that gnaws like a rat in your gut. You don't know it, but you're building a kind of armor, not of steel, but of stubborn endurance, the kind that lets you face another dawn without breaking. What's wild is how normal this feels to you. There's no outrage, no burning need for justice. Those are luxuries for people with names and futures. You don't question why you're here, why your parents' eyes are so hollow, why the master's dogs eat better than you do. You accept it, the way you accept the rain or the cold. It's not resignation, it's survival, pure and unadorned. You find small tricks to make it bearable, humming a tuneless song to match the rhythm of your work, or watching the sparrows dart above the fields, free in a way you can't comprehend. These aren't joys, but they're enough to keep you moving, to keep you alive. Now let's talk about your place in this world, or rather, your lack of one. The feudal system is a pyramid, and you're not even on the bottom rung. You're the dirt beneath it. The lord owns the land, the peasants work it, and you're the grease that keeps the whole creaking thing turning. You don't belong to yourself. You belong to the estate, to the master, to a system that sees you as less than the cattle you tend. Yet there's a cruel irony here. Without you, the fields go fallow, the bread goes unbaked, and the manser grinds to a halt. You're invisible, but indispensable, a paradox you'll never have the words to articulate. If you're wondering how this compares to today, think about the things we take for granted: a name, a birthday, a moment to rest. You had none of these, yet you carried on, not because you were brave, but because you had to. We celebrate resilience now, slap it on motivational posters, but you lived it without fanfare, without choice. Your life was a testament to what humans can endure, a quiet middle finger to a world that tried to crush you. And here's the kicker: you didn't even know you were fighting. You just kept going day after day because that's what survival demanded. As the years creep on, you grow taller and stronger, but no freer. Your hands, once small and trembling, are now rough as bark, your back a map of aches. You're still learning the master's moods, still dodging the overseer's stick, still sleeping on straw that smells of dampness and despair. But there's a rhythm to it now, a grim kind of music. You move with the seasons, the crops, the endless cycle of toil. You don't hope for more, not yet. Hope is a dangerous thing, and you're too busy staying alive to entertain it. But deep down, in a place you don't yet know, there's a flicker, a stubborn refusal to be nothing, even if the world insists you are. So here you are, a child of no name, no future, no choice, yet somehow still standing. Your life is a speck in the vast grinding machine of medieval Europe, but it's yours, carved out of mud and sweat and sheer unspoken will. You don't know it, but you're a kind of hero, not the kind with swords or songs, but the kind who keeps the world turning, even when it doesn't care to notice. And as you trudge through another day, bucket in hand, you're writing a story nobody will read, but everyone should remember. Dawn slices through the dark like a blade, and you're awake, your body creaking like the old wooden beams of the stable you call home. No rooster crows for you. The ache in your bones is alarm enough. You're a medieval slave, tethered to a lord's estate somewhere in the muddy heart of Europe. And today, like every day, is a marathon of toil. You stumble into the chill morning air, the ground cold under your bare feet, and head for the millstone, its groan already echoing in your skull. Grinding grain isn't just work, it's a rhythm, a relentless pulse that sets the tempo for your life. Your shoulders burn, your hands blister, but you keep turning the stone because stopping isn't an option. The flour dust coats your skin, a ghostly second hide, and your stomach snarls, reminding you that hunger is your oldest friend. This is no romanticized Middle Ages with gallant knights or merry feasts. It's 11th century grime where your existence is measured in buckets hauled and fields cleared. You move from the mill to the well, the rope biting into your palms as you draw water for the manor's kitchens. The bucket's weight pulls at your spine, but you've learned to lean into the pain, to make it part of you. Next, you're in the stables, shoveling manure, the stench so thick it's practically a second skin. You knead dough for bread you'll never taste, the irony as bitter as the coarse flour. The sun climbs, indifferent, and you don't pause. To pause is to invite the overseer's stick, and you've got enough scars to know better. Your day is a chain of tasks, each one heavier than the last, and there's no end, only the slow crawl toward dusk. Here's the shock of it: nobody cares if you break. The Lord, sipping wine in his stone hall, doesn't know your name. The cook, barking orders, see you as hands, not a heart. Even the other slaves, their eyes as hollow as yours, don't ask how you're holding up. There's no time for that. You're not allowed to complain, not because it's forbidden, but because nobody listens. Your voice is as useless as a cracked pot. If the master's pleased, you might get a crust of bread, dry as dust, and a bowl of watery soup that's more grit than nourishment. If he's not, you curl up on the dirt floor, your belly a knot of need, and try to sleep through the gnawing. It's not cruelty, it's just how the world spins, and you're caught in its gears. Let's paint the scene a bit more. The estate is a living beast, its pulse the clatter of tools and the low hum of labor. Free peasants trudge past, their steps lighter, their laughter a foreign tongue. You watch them, not with envy, but with a quiet curiosity. What's it like to walk away at day's end, to have a home that's yours? You don't hate them. Their lives are hard too, just a different kind of hard. You're all cogs, but they get to leave the machine at night while you're bolted to it. The manor looms in the distance, its walls a reminder of the world you'll never enter. You're not part of its warmth, its feasts, its flickering hearths. You're the shadow that keeps it standing, invisible but essential. Now compare that to today. We grumble about long hours, about bosses who don't see us, but you? Your work isn't just a job, it's your entire existence, etched into every callus and scar. We have coffee breaks, weekends, and the hope of a better gig. You have nothing but the next task, the next day, the next dawn. Yet there's a strange resilience in you, not the kind we plaster on inspirational quotes, but the raw, unpolished kind that keeps you moving when every muscle screams to stop. You don't think about it, you just do it, because the alternative is unthinkable. It's a strength we might admire, even if we'd never want to test it ourselves. Back to your day. The sun's higher now, and you're hauling firewood, the splinters digging into your hands like tiny teeth. You're not strong, not in the way knights are, but you've got a stubborn endurance, forged in years of carrying more than your share. You sweep the courtyard, the broom an extension of your arm, and you're so focused on avoiding the overseer's eye that you barely notice the world around you. The sky could be blue or gray, it doesn't matter. Your world is the task in front of you, the weight in your hands, the ache in your back. You're not allowed to dream, but sometimes in the monotony, your mind wanders. You see a bird, wings cutting the air, and for a split second, you wonder what it's like to be that free. Then the overseer barks, and you're back to reality. What's wild is how you've made peace with this, not because you love it, but because it's all you know. You don't rage against the master or curse the system. Those are luxuries for people with time to think. You just work, your body a machine that's learned to run on fumes. There's a kind of grim artistry to it, the way you've honed your movements to waste no energy, to dodge punishment with a well-timed step. You're not graceful, but you're efficient, a master of survival in a world that doesn't care if you live or die. You find small ways to cope, counting your steps to the well, humming a tuneless rhythm as you knead dough. These aren't joys, but they're lifelines, threads that keep you tethered to something human. Let's talk about the food, or lack of it. If the master's in a good mood, you get that crust of bread, maybe a sip of soup that's more water than anything else. It's not enough, never enough, but you've learned to savor it to make it last. You chew slowly, not because you're savoring the taste. There's none, but because it's all you'll get until tomorrow. On bad days, when the master's angry or the harvest is lean, you get nothing. You sleep with hunger as your bedmate, its claws digging into your gut. You don't complain, not out loud. You've seen what happens to those who do. A lash, a kick, a night in the cold. You learn to eat the silence, to swallow the want, to keep moving. Here's where history grounds us. In medieval Europe, slaves like you were the backbone of the feudal economy, working the fields, tending the livestock, and keeping the manor alive. The Domesday Book of 1086, a snapshot of England's wealth, lists thousands of slaves, roughly 1 in 10 people, treated as property, not souls. You weren't just labor, you were an asset, like the plow or the mill. The church, for all its talk of divine love, didn't blink at owning slaves, and the law saw you as chattel, to be bought, sold, or beaten at will. This wasn't personal, it was systemic, a machine that ground down generations, and you were just one of its cogs, turning endlessly. Now let's reflect. We live in a world of choices, where a bad day might mean a late bus or a rude email. You lived in a world where a bad day meant no food, a beating, or worse. We chased promotions, vacations, and meaning. You chased survival, not because you wanted to, but because it was all you had. Yet there's a kind of awe in that. You didn't have the luxury of self-pity, but you had something else, a raw, unspoken tenacity that carried you through days that would crush most of us. We might call it grit, but you wouldn't. You'd just call it life, and you lived it, one back-breaking step at a time. As the sun dips, your day isn't done. You're still hauling, still sweeping, still dodging the overseer's glare. Dusk brings no relief, only the promise of a dirt floor and a few hours of sleep before it starts again. You don't think about tomorrow. It's just another today, another grind. But in your small, stubborn way, you're defying the world that tries to erase you. You're not a hero, not in the way stories are told, but you're something fiercer, a survivor, carving existence out of nothing. And as you collapse onto the straw, your body a map of aches. You don't know it, but you're writing a history that deserves to be heard, even if it's only in whispers. Winter creeps into your world like a thief, stealing warmth and leaving only a bone-deep chill that clings to your skin. You're a medieval slave, tethered to a lord's estate in the heart of Europe's 11th century, and the cold is no mere inconvenience. It's a predator, silent and relentless. Your thin tunic, patched and threadbare, is as useless as a whisper against the frost. You wake in the stable, your breath clouding in the dark, the straw beneath you damp and reeking of mildew. No blanket cocoons you, no fire beckons. The world outside is a gray expanse of frozen mud and bare trees, and you step into it, your bare feet stinging as if kissed by knives. Work doesn't stop for winter, and neither do you, because the alternative is a lash or worse. Hunger, your old companion, gnaws sharper now, a rat in your gut that never sleeps. This isn't the cozy winter of storybooks, with crackling hearths and mulled wine. It's a brutal season that strips the manor to its bones, and you, a slave, are its most expendable part. You trudge to the fields, the ground is hard as iron underfoot, to break frozen soil or haul firewood for a hall you'll never enter. Your hands, already cracked from years of labor, split open, blood seeping into the cold like an offering to some cruel god. The pain is constant, but you've learned to carry it, to make it a rhythm like the swing of an axe. You stack logs, clear snow from paths, and feed the livestock, their warmth a taunt you can't afford to linger in. Every task is a battle against the cold, and losing means more than discomfort. It means punishment, hunger, or a night exposed to the elements. Here's the shock of it. Winter doesn't just test your body, it tries to erase you. The manor's lords and ladies, snug in their fur-lined halls, don't spare a thought for you. The free peasants, huddled in their own meager cottages, have no warmth to share. You're alone in this fight, you and the other slaves, your faces gaunt, your eyes dulled by the endless gray. You huddle together at night, not out of friendship, but survival. Your body's a fragile bulwark against the frost. Words are few. There's nothing to say when every breath is a struggle. You sleep, if you can call it that, with hunger clawing at your insides, your dreams as empty as your belly. The cold doesn't care about your name, your pain, or your will to live. It wants you gone, and it's patient. Picture the scene. The estate is a ghost under winter's grip, its fields barren, its walls slick with ice. The air bites your lungs, and each inhale a shard of glass. You move through the day like a specter, your hands trembling as you carry buckets of half-frozen water or shovel manure that steams in the frigid air. The overseer's voice cuts through the wind, sharp as a whip, urging you faster, as if speed could thaw the world. You don't look up, don't meet his eyes. You've learned that invisibility is your shield, though it's a flimsy one. The animals in the stables, better fed than you, snort and stamp, their breath a cruel mimicry of the warmth you crave. You're not jealous. You're too tired for that. You just keep moving, because motion is life and stillness is death. Now let's ground this in history. In medieval Europe, winter was a crucible, especially for slaves who formed the backbone of the feudal system. The Domesday Book of 1086, a ledger of England's wealth, counted slaves as property, about 1 in 10 people, valued alongside livestock, not souls. Harsh winters decimated crops and strained resources, and slaves bore the brunt. No laws protected you. The church, preaching divine order, saw your suffering as part of God's plan. You were expendable, your life a flicker easily snuffed by cold or hunger. Yet you endured, not because you were special, but because you had to. Your survival was a quiet defiance, a testament to a strength the ledgers never recorded. Compare this to today, where we bundle up against the cold with coats and heaters, grumbling about icy windshields or power bills. You had no such armor, no such complaints. Your winter was a war, fought with cracked hands and a will forged in desperation. We stress over deadlines or social slights, but you fought a silent enemy that wanted your life, and you did it with nothing, no hope, no reward, just the raw instinct to see another dawn. We call resilience a buzzword, but you lived it, your every step a middle finger to a world that bet against you. It's humbling, isn't it? We have thermostats and takeout. You had straw and stubbornness, and somehow that was enough. Back to your day. You're hauling firewood now, the logs heavy as sin, their bark scraping your already raw hands. The cold makes every movement clumsy, your fingers stiff as twigs. You don't drop the load, you can't. A mistake means a beating, and you've got enough bruises to last a lifetime. You stack the wood outside the manor, close enough to feel the faint heat seeping from its walls, but never close enough to claim it. You're not bitter. Bitterness takes energy, and you've got none to spare. You move to the next task, clearing ice from the well, your hands plunged into the water, so cold it burns. The pain is a companion now, as familiar as the hunger that twists your gut. You don't think about it. You work, because work is survival, and survival is all you know. What's staggering is how you've adapted to this. You don't curse the cold or beg for mercy. Those are for people with voices that matter. You've learned to sleep through the ache, to curl your body so tightly that the shivers become a kind of lullaby. You don't cry, not anymore. Tears froze in you long ago, replaced by a quiet, unyielding focus. You found small tricks to endure, blowing on your hands to steal a moment's warmth, tucking straw into your tunic for insulation. These aren't victories, but they're enough to keep you going, to keep you alive. You're not a hero, not in the way bards sing, but you're something fiercer, a survivor carved from frost and will. Let's linger on that survival. In a world that sees you as less than the oxen you tend, you've learned to navigate winter's cruelty with a cunning no one acknowledges. You know which corners of the stable hold the least draft, how to share body heat without speaking, and how to ration your strength for the long, dark months. It's not knowledge you sought, it's knowledge you've earned, paid for in blood and frostbite. The manor depends on you. Your labor keeps its fires lit, its tables set, yet it offers you nothing but the right to exist another day. There's a cruel poetry in that, a truth we might overlook in our warm, modern lives. You're the foundation of a world that doesn't see you, and you carry it anyway. Reflect for a moment. We live in an age of comfort, where a cold day means a thicker scarf or a stronger coffee. You lived in an age where cold meant life or death, and you chose life, not with grand gestures, but with every stubborn, shivering breath. We chase meaning in careers or likes. You chased survival, not because it was noble, but because it was all you had. There's a lesson there, one we might not want to hear. Your strength wasn't in fighting back, but in enduring, in finding a way to live when the world said you shouldn't. We might call it grit, but you wouldn't. You'd just call it another day, and you faced it, head down, heart steady. As winter tightens its grip, you keep moving, your body a machine running on fumes. You haul, you shovel, you endure, each task a small act of defiance against the cold that wants to claim you. Night falls, and you collapse onto the straw, your breath a faint cloud in the dark. You huddle with the others, silent, sharing what little warmth you have. Spring is a distant promise, a rumor you don't dare believe. But you survive, not because you're strong, but because you're stubborn, because something in you refuses to break. You don't know it, but you're writing a history of resilience, one frozen step at a time, a story that whispers to us across centuries. To live is to fight, even when the fight is invisible. The whip cracks like thunder, and your back burns as if kissed by fire, a sharp reminder that you're a medieval slave, less a person than a possession in the eyes of the Lord's estate. It's the 11th century, and you're toiling on a sprawling manor somewhere in Europe's muddy heart, where the master's mood is as fickle as the wind. You spilled a bucket of water, or maybe you moved too slowly fetching firewood. The truth is, it doesn't matter. The overseer's lash finds you because it can, because your existence is a canvas for his whims. The pain is hot, immediate, but it's the humiliation that lingers, the way the young master's son watches, his eyes cold as frost, as if you're no more human than the dogs he tosses scraps to. You bite back a cry, not out of pride, but because tears earn nothing but another strike. This isn't the chivalric Middle Ages of ballads and banners. It's a world where your life is a thread in someone else's tapestry, easily snipped. Punishment isn't reserved for grand crimes. There's no trial, no judge, just the master's temper or the overseer's bad day. You might be beaten for a crooked row in the field, a broken tool, or simply because the Lord lost at dice and needs someone to blame. The whip is common, its leather bis rated with cruelty, but fists, sticks, or even a well-aimed boot serve just as well. Each blow carves a scar, a tally mark of your place in this unforgiving order. You learn to anticipate the master's moods, to read the tightening of his jaw or the glint in his eye, because foresight is your only shield, flimsy as it is. Here's the shock of it. The worst pain isn't the whip, but the indifference. The young master's son, barely 10, stares as you're struck, his gaze empty of pity, as if you're a broken plow, not a soul. He's learning what you already know, that you're less than the hounds he plays with, less than the mud on his boots. The manor's folk, from the cook to the free peasants, turn away, their silence louder than the lash. You're not beaten because you're guilty. You're beaten because you're there. After all, the system demands a scapegoat, and you're the easiest target. It's not personal, it's feudal, a machine that grinds you down to keep its wheels turning, and nobody blinks. Imagine the scene. The courtyard is a churn of mud and straw, the air thick with the scent of smoke and sweat. You're on your knees, the whip's sting still fresh, while the overseer looms, his shadow long in the fading light. The manor looms too, its stone walls a fortress you'll never enter, its warmth a dream you can't afford. Other slaves shuffle past, heads down, their own scars a mirror to yours. You don't meet their eyes. There's no comfort in shared suffering, only the risk of drawing attention. The young master's son lingers, his fine cloak a mockery of your tattered tunic. He doesn't laugh or jeer, he just watches, and that's worse. You're not a person to him, just a lesson in power, one he's learning far too young. Let's anchor this in history. In medieval Europe, slaves were chattel and owned body and soul by lords or monasteries. The Domesday Book of 1086, England's great accounting, lists slaves as property, about 1 in 10 people, valued alongside oxen and plows. No law protected you. The church, preaching divine order, saw your suffering as God's will. Punishment was a tool, not just to discipline, but to dehumanize, to remind you and everyone else of your place. Whippings, brandings, or worse, were meted out at whim, often in public to set an example. You weren't a citizen, not even a serf with meager rights. You were nothing, and the lash was there to keep you that way. Now compare this to today. We fume over unfair bosses or petty slights, but you faced a world where punishment needed no reason, where a child's cold stare cut deeper than a whip. We have HR departments, labor laws, and the right to walk away. You had nothing but your own skin, and even that wasn't yours. Yet there's a raw strength in you, not the kind we celebrate in TED Talks, but the kind that lets you stand after a beating, wipe the blood, and carry on. We call it resilience, but you wouldn't. You'd call it survival, and you wore it like armor, forged in pain and quiet defiance. Back to the moment. The whip falls again, and you clench your jaw, your body a map of old and new scars. The pain is a language you've learned to speak. Each lash is a word you can't escape. You don't scream. Screaming only makes it worse. You focus on the ground, the mud under your knees, the faint warmth of your own blood. The overseer tires eventually, his arm not as strong as his spite, and you're left to stagger back to work. You haul firewood, the weight heavier now, or return to the fields, your hands shaking but steady enough to avoid notice. You've learned to move faster, to bow lower, to vanish into the rhythm of labor. It's not fear, it's strategy, a dance you've perfected to stay alive. What's staggering is how you've internalized this. You don't hate the master or curse the overseer, those emotions are luxuries, and you're too busy surviving to afford them. You're tired, bone deep tired but angry. It's a spark you can't fan into flame. You've seen what happens to those who fight back: a broken body, a noose, or a slow death in the cold. So you adapt, your spirit bending but not breaking. You learn to anticipate the whip before it falls, to sense the master's mood in the way he holds his cup. It's not submission, it's survival, a quiet rebellion in every step you take, every task you complete without crumbling. Let's linger on that young master's son. He's the future, the next link in this chain, and his indifference is a lesson in itself. He doesn't hate you, he doesn't need to. You're part of the world he's inheriting, like the fields or the manor's walls. His cold eyes are a mirror of the system, one that teaches him power before compassion and control before kindness. You see it, and it hurts more than the whip, because it's a reminder that this world isn't changing, not for you, not for your children, if you ever dare to have them. You don't dwell on it. Dwelling is for people with time. You work because work is your shield, your sword, your only way through. Reflect for a moment. We live in a world where we demand fairness, where a harsh word can spark outrage. You lived in a world where fairness was a fairy tale, where a child's glance could wound deeper than a lash. We have rights, voices, and the power to walk away. You had nothing but your own stubborn will, and yet you carried on, not with hope, but with a grit that's hard to fathom. There's a lesson here, one we might shy from. Your strength wasn't in rebellion, but in endurance, in facing a world that didn't care and surviving it anyway. We might call it courage, but you wouldn't. You just call it another day, and you lived it, scar by scar. As the day grinds on, you return to your tasks, the pain a dull hum beneath your skin. You haul water, sweep stables, and move like a shadow through a world that doesn't see you. The scars on your back are a map no one reads, a story no one tells. But you keep going, not because you're brave, but because stopping isn't an option. You're not a hero, not in the way history remembers, but you're something fiercer, a survivor, etching your existence into a world that tries to erase you. And as you work, blood drying on your skin, you don't know it, but you're writing a history of resilience, one lash at a time, a whisper that echoes across centuries. To live is to endure, even when the world says you shouldn't. The market hums like a living thing, with a chaotic pulse of voices, clattering carts, and the sharp tang of fresh bread you'll never taste. You're a medieval slave, stepping out from the shadowed drudgery of the Lord's estate into this rare burst of color and noise, somewhere in the gritty sprawl of 11th century Europe. Your tunic is patched, your feet caked with mud, but for once, you're not hauling buckets or dodging the overseer's stick. The master sent you to the village market with a coin for errands, grain perhaps, or a tool, and you clutch it like a talisman, its cold weight a fleeting tether to a world beyond the manor's walls. The crowd swirls around you, free folk bargaining, laughing, living, and for a moment, their chatter drowns out the grind of your existence. You're not one of them, but you're here, and that's enough to spark something small, something alive in your chest. This isn't the Middle Ages of gleaming armor or courtly dances. It's a raw, bustling world where you, a slave, are as invisible as the dust underfoot, except today. The market is a rare reprieve, a crack in the iron routine of your life. You weave through stalls piled with apples, wool, and iron nails, your eyes drinking in sights you barely understand. A vendor's quick smile catches you off guard, not because it's kind, but because it's aimed at you as if you're more than a shadow. You don't smile back. Smiling feels foreign, but you carry that moment like a secret. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and herbs, a sharp contrast to the stable's damp rot. You're still a slave, still bound, but here in this fleeting hour, you glimpse a world that breathes, and it stirs something you can't name. Here's the shock of it. For a moment, you feel human, not a tool, not a beast of burden, but a person seen by strangers who don't know your chains. It's not freedom, don't be fooled, but it's a taste of something close, a sip of water in a desert of toil. An old woman by a cart sings, her voice rough as gravel but warm as a hearth, and you pause, stunned because you know the tune. You don't know when you learned it, but it's there, buried under years of labor, a fragment of a life you never claimed. You hum along, soft as a whisper, and for those few notes, you're not invisible. The world sees you, not as a slave, but as a soul, and it's a jolt, a quiet lightning that makes your heart stumble. Picture the market in all its chaos. The square is a patchwork of stalls, their awnings sagging under the weight of morning dew. Merchants shout, hawking fish and cloth, while children dart through the crowd, their laughter a language you've forgotten. You move carefully, the coin in your fist a dangerous treasure. Steal it, and you'd face a beating or worse, but the thought flickers, tempting as a flame. You don't act on it, you know the cost. Instead, you navigate the crowd, your eyes wide, soaking in the faces, the colors, the life. A juggler tosses apples, a dog snaps at scraps, and the old woman's song weaves through it all, a thread of warmth in the cold tapestry of your day. You're not part of this world, but you're in it, and that's a miracle you don't dare question. Let's ground this in history. Markets in medieval Europe were the heartbeat of villages, where free folk traded goods and gossip, but for slaves like you, they were a rare window to the outside. The feudal system, rigid as stone, kept you chained to the manor, your labor fueling the lord's wealth. The Domesday Book of 1086 lists slaves, about 1 in 10 in England, as property, not people, their lives unrecorded beyond their output. Yet markets were a loophole, a place where the system's edges softened. You were sent to fetch supplies, not to mingle, but the chaos of commerce gave you a fleeting chance to see, to hear, to exist beyond the plow. These moments were rare and tightly controlled, but they were lifelines, proof that the world was bigger than your chains. Now compare this to today. We scroll through feeds, chasing likes and fleeting joys, but you found a spark of life in a stranger's smile, a song you didn't know you knew. We have the freedom to roam, to choose, and to dream, yet we often feel caged by stress or expectation. You had no choices, no dreams, yet this market, this hour, was a rebellion of the heart, a quiet claim to your own humanity. We seek meaning in careers or trends. You found it in a tune, a glance, a moment that cost nothing but meant everything. It's humbling, isn't it? We have endless distractions, but you had this, one bright, fragile thread, and it was enough to keep you going, back to the market. You're at a stall now, handing over the coin for a sack of grain, your fingers brushing the vendor's rough hand. He doesn't know you're a slave, doesn't care, and that indifference is a strange kind of gift. You're just another face, not a tool or a burden. You linger, not because you can, but because you must, stealing seconds of this world before the manor reclaims you. The old woman's song fades, but you carry it, humming under your breath as you shoulder the grain. The crowd presses close, their warmth a contrast to the stable's chill, and you let yourself imagine, just for a heartbeat, that you belong. It's a dangerous thought, one you bury deep, but it's there, a seed in barren soil. What's wild is how you cling to these moments. You don't hope for freedom. Hope is a trap, and you're too practical for that. But you savor this, the market's pulse, the song, the fleeting sense of being seen. You've learned to hoard these glimmers like a miser with gold, tucking them away for the long nights of hunger and cold. They're not escape, not rebellion, but they're fuel, enough to carry you through another day of grinding grain or dodging the whip. You don't have words for joy, but this is close, a warmth that lingers even as you trudge back to the manor. The coin is gone, the grain heavy on your back. Let's linger on that old woman's song. It's not just a melody, it's a bridge to something older, something human, a piece of you that the manor can't touch. You don't know where you learned it, maybe from your mother, her voice a ghost in your memory, or from another slave. They're humming a quiet act of defiance. It's yours now, a secret you carry, and in the market's chaos, it's a lifeline. You hum it as you walk, the grain digging into your shoulder, the manor's shadow looming closer. The song doesn't change your life, but it changes you, just enough to face the next task, the next lash, the next dawn. Reflect for a moment. We chase happiness in big moments, vacations, promotions, viral posts, but you found it in a song, a smile, a stolen second of being seen. We have the freedom to chase our dreams, yet we often feel lost. You had no freedom, no dreams, yet you built a spark of meaning from scraps, and it was enough to keep you alive. There's a lesson here, one we might shy from. Your strength wasn't in grand gestures, but in seizing these tiny joys, in claiming your humanity when the world denied it. We might call it resilience, but you wouldn't. You'd call it survival, and you lived it, note by note. As you leave the market, the noise fades, the manor's silence swallowing you whole. You're a slave again, the coin spent, the song a memory. But you carry that glimmer, tucked deep where the overseer's whip can't reach. You haul the grain, your steps heavy, your body aching, but there's a rhythm now, a faint echo of the market's pulse. You're not free, not even close, but you're alive, and in that life, there's a stubborn spark, a quiet defiance that says you're more than the world allows. You don't know it, but you're writing a history of survival, one stolen moment at a time, a whisper that echoes across centuries. To live is to find light, even in the darkest chains. The grind of the millstone is your heartbeat, a relentless thud that drowns out the quiet ache gnawing at your core. You're a medieval slave, tethered to a lord's estate in the muddy sprawl of 11th century Europe, where each day bleeds into the next, a gray smear of labor and survival. There's a heaviness in you, not just from the buckets you haul or the whip's lingering sting, but something deeper, a shadow you can't name. Sadness? Emptiness? You don't have words for it, only the rhythm of your tasks. Grind the grain, carry the water, clean the stables. Repeat. You tell yourself you're fine, because what else is there? To pause, to think, is to invite a void that might swallow you whole. So you move, Your body a machine running on fumes, your mind a locked door against questions you can't afford to ask. This isn't the Middle Ages of heroic quests or candlelit feasts. It's a world where you, a slave, are the unseen cog in a feudal machine, your life a footnote no one reads. You don't dream of escape. Where would you go? The forest is a snarl of wolves and bandits. The village is a cage of suspicious eyes. Tomorrow is today, just another loop of toil under a sky that's always heavy, as if it's too tired to lift its own weight. You don't think about the future, because it's a luxury as foreign as the Lord's fine cloak. Instead, you focus on the now, the weight of the grain sack, the burn in your shoulders, the overseer's shadow lurking nearby. You're not living for hope. You're living to live, and that's a victory the manor's walls can't claim. Here's the shock of it. You don't even know you're suffering. There's no word for despair in your world, no priest to name your sorrow, no friend to ask why your eyes are so dull. You feel it, this weight, but you bury it under the rhythm of work, because to acknowledge it is to risk breaking. You're not weak, far from it, but you're human, and humans weren't built to carry this forever. Yet you do, day after day, without a name for the ache or hope for its end. It's not resignation, it's survival, a stubborn refusal to let the void win. You tell yourself you're fine, and in that lie, you find the strength to keep moving, to keep breathing, to keep being. Picture the estate at dusk, the sky a bruise, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and smoke. You're at the mill, the stones grown your only company, your hands dusted white with flour you'll never taste. The other slaves move like ghosts, their faces mirrors of your own, gaunt, guarded, silent. You don't speak of the heaviness. There's no point. Words don't fill bellies or soften whips. You haul water next. The bucket's weight a familiar foe, your steps mechanical but precise. You've learned to work through the ache, to ignore the way your body begs for rest. The manor looms in the distance, its lights a taunt, its warmth a world you'll never touch. You're not bitter. Bitterness is for those with time to feel. You're just tired, and you tell yourself it's enough to keep going. Let's ground this in history. In medieval Europe, slaves like you were the sinew of the feudal system, toiling to keep manors alive while your own lives were erased. The Domesday Book of 1086, a ledger of England's wealth, counted slaves, roughly 1 in 10 people, as property, not souls, their existence reduced to numbers beside livestock. The church, preaching divine order, offered no solace. Your suffering was God's plan, your place fixed by birth. There was no concept of mental health, no language for the toll of endless labor and dehumanization. You weren't seen as broken because you weren't seen at all. Yet you endured, not with grand defiance, but with a quiet, unspoken will that history rarely honors but should never forget. Now compare this to today. We label our struggles, stress, burnout, anxiety, and seek therapy, meds, or mindfulness apps to cope. You carried a weight without a name, without a cure, and still you worked, you lived. We chase purpose in careers or passions. You found purpose in surviving another day, not because it was noble, but because it was all you had. We have choices, voices, and the right to rest. You had none, yet you forged a path through the void, step by stubborn step. It's humbling, isn't it? We fret over likes or deadlines, but you carried an unnamed sorrow and called it life, a resilience we might envy, even if we'd never trade places. Back to your day. You're in the stables now, shoveling manure, the stench a second skin. The work is mindless, but that's a mercy. It keeps the heaviness at bay. You don't think about tomorrow because it's just another today, another grind. You don't dream of escape because the world beyond the manor is a myth, as distant as the stars. You tell yourself you're fine, and it's not a lie, not really. It's a shield, a way to keep the void from creeping closer. You've learned to find rhythm in the work, to let the repetition dull the ache. Grind, carry, clean, repeat. It's not a life, but it's yours, and you hold it tight because letting go means losing everything. What's staggering is how you've made this bearable. You don't hope for better. That's a trap, and you're too wise for it. But you find small anchors. The way the millstones groan matches your breath. The brief warmth of sunlight on your face. The faint memory of a market song. These aren't joys, but they're enough to keep you moving, to keep you whole. You've built a kind of armor, not of steel, but of routine, of stubborn endurance. You don't know it, but you're a master of survival, navigating a world that doesn't see you with a grace no one acknowledges. You're not a hero, not in the way bards sing, but you're something fiercer, a soul that refuses to break. Let's linger on that heaviness. It's not despair, not exactly, because despair implies a choice to feel. You don't choose this, it's just there, a stone in your chest, a shadow that grows with each passing year. You don't talk about it, there's no one to listen, and words are a luxury you can't afford. You bury it under work, under the rhythm of your tasks, because to face it is to risk unraveling. Yet you carry it, this unnamed weight, and you don't crumble. You tell yourself you're fine, and in that act, you claim a kind of power, a quiet defiance that the manor's whips and ledgers can't touch. Reflect for a moment. We live in a world where we name our pain, and here we seek help or distraction to ease it. You lived in a world where the pain had no name, where help was a fairy tale, and still you carried on. We chase happiness in big moments, trips, achievements, love. You found it in surviving, in the stubborn act of being, even when the world said you were nothing. There's a lesson here, one we might shy from. Your strength wasn't in fighting the system, but in living through it, in carrying a weight no one saw and calling it life. We might call it courage, but you wouldn't. You'd call it another day, and you faced it, breath by breath. As night falls, you collapse onto the straw, the stable's damp chill your only blanket. The heaviness is still there, but you don't fight it. You tell yourself you're fine, and you sleep, your body curled against the cold, your mind a fortress of routine. You're a shadow in a world of lords and ladies, a speck in the feudal machine, but you're alive, and in that life, there's a stubborn spark, a quiet refusal to be nothing. You don't know it, but you're writing a history of endurance, one unnamed ache at a time, a whisper that echoes across centuries. To live is to carry on, even when the world doesn't care. In the shadowed folds of medieval Europe, where the ruins of Rome whispered beneath new kingdoms, slavery was no fleeting cruelty but a cornerstone, as fixed as the stone walls of a lord's manor. Picture a landscape of mud and ambition, where the 5th to 11th centuries saw fragmented tribes and nascent empires lean on human bondage to fuel their fields and forges. Slaves, stripped of names and futures, were the silent sinew of this world, their lives woven into the fabric of a feudal order that saw them as tools, not souls. The origins of this system stretch back to the Roman Empire, where captives of war and debtors filled sprawling estates, their labor a currency of conquest. As Rome crumbled, its machinery of enslavement didn't vanish. It morphed, seeping into the bones of the kingdoms that rose from its ashes, a grim inheritance that no one questioned. The Roman latifundia, vast agricultural estates worked by chained hands, set a blueprint that medieval Europe never fully abandoned. By the 4th century, Rome's wars had flooded its markets with prisoners, Gauls, Germans, Dacians, sold to till fields or toil in mines. When the empire fractured, these practices endured, adapted by Germanic tribes like the Franks and Visigoths, who saw no reason to upend a system that enriched them. Slaves were chattel, their humanity erased by ledgers that listed them alongside oxen and plows. In the Merovingian and Carolingian eras, from the 5th to 9th centuries, Frankish kings and their nobles relied on slaves to clear forests, plant crops, and build the stone churches that dotted the landscape. It wasn't just economics, it was power, a way to flex control over lives as easily as land. What's striking is how unremarkable this was. No chronicler blinked at the sight of slaves bent under burdens. No priest decried their chains from the pulpit. The church, a rising force in medieval life, didn't just tolerate slavery, it embraced it. Monasteries, those beacons of piety, owned slaves to work their fields, their labor tithing to God. Canon law, the church's legal spine, permitted the enslavement of non-Christians and captives of just wars, a loophole wide enough to justify almost anything. By the 8th century, as Charlemagne forged his empire, slaves were a fixture, their numbers swelled by wars against Saxons and Slavs. The term slave itself began to take root, derived from Slav, a nod to the Eastern European captives sold across the continent, their lives a currency of conquest. Let's paint the scene. A manor in 9th century Francia hums with labor, fields tilled, bread baked, iron forged, all on the backs of slaves who move like shadows under the overseer's eye. These men and women, often born to enslaved parents, know no other life. Their days are a cycle of toil, their nights a cold huddle in straw. The Lord, perched in his hall, counts his wealth not just in gold, but in bodies, each one a piece of his power. The law, a patchwork of Roman codes and Germanic customs, offers no protection. Slaves are property to be bought, sold, or beaten at whim. The Visigothic code of the 7th century, for instance, allowed masters to punish slaves with lashes or mutilation, their suffering a legal footnote. It wasn't cruelty, it was order, as natural as the seasons to those who held the whip. Now consider the scale. By the 11th century, slavery was no fringe practice, but a pillar of the feudal economy. In England, the Domesday Book of 1086, a meticulous ledger of William the Conqueror's realm, recorded roughly 1 in 10 people as slaves, tens of thousands, their lives reduced to numbers beside livestock. They worked fields, tended animals, and built the manors that defined the age, their labor the grease in the feudal machine. In the Byzantine Empire, the eastern heir to Rome, slaves rowed galleys and toiled in workshops, their numbers fed by wars and raids. Even in the smaller kingdoms of Iberia or Scandinavia, slavery thrived, its roots deep in the Roman soil that still shaped their laws and minds. This wasn't a system that needed defending. It was a system no one thought to question. Compare this to today, where we recoil at the word slavery, our minds shaped by centuries of abolitionist thought and human rights. Yet in medieval Europe, the idea of universal dignity was a whisper, drowned by the clang of power. We live in a world of labor laws and unions, where exploitation is cloaked in subtler forms: low wages, gig economies, and sweatshops. Back then, exploitation was raw, unapologetic, a truth etched into every slave's scar. We might pat ourselves on the back for progress, but let's not kid ourselves. The medieval world's indifference to suffering wasn't unique. It was human, a reminder of how easily we justify what's convenient. The slave's resilience, their ability to endure a life without hope, is a mirror we might not want to look into, but should. Let's dig deeper into the mechanics. Slaves weren't just war captives, they were a renewable resource. Debt could chain a free man to a master's will, and his family sold to settle accounts. Criminals, too, faced enslavement, their freedom a price for petty theft or defiance. Children born to slaves inherited their chains, a cycle as fixed as the stars. In Anglo-Saxon England, a free woman could be enslaved for marrying a slave, her choice a trap that bound her and her offspring. The law was a noose, tightening around the vulnerable, ensuring the manor's fields never lacked hands. The Salic law of the Franks from the 6th century set prices for slaves, 30 solidi for a healthy male, less for a woman or child, as if their worth could be counted in coin. It was a system built to last, and it did for centuries. What's chilling is the silence around it. Medieval chronicles, brimming with tales of kings and battles, rarely mention slaves, as if their lives were too small to matter. When they do appear, it's in passing, a note on a manor's wealth, a legal ruling on their punishment. The Bayeux Tapestry, that vivid stitch of Norman conquest, shows laborers toiling, but their status, slave or serf, is a blur, their humanity lost in the threads. Yet their labor was the foundation of everything: the wheat that fed armies, the stone that built cathedrals, the iron that armed knights. Without slaves, the medieval world would have stuttered, its ambitions starved. They were invisible, but indispensable, a paradox that history buries under tales of glory. Let's reflect on the human cost. Imagine a slave, his hands calloused, his back scarred, waking each day to a life that offered no reprieve. He didn't dream of freedom. Freedom was a word for others. He worked, ate, slept, and died, his life a cycle of survival no one recorded. The church told him his suffering was divine. The law told him he was nothing. Yet he endured not with heroics, but with a stubborn will that carried him through decades of toil. We might call it grit, but he wouldn't. He'd call it life, and he lived it day by day, a testament to a strength we can barely fathom. Today, we chase meaning in likes or careers, but he found it in simply being, in refusing to break under a system that expected him to. The broader picture is no less grim. Slavery's roots in Rome gave it a kind of legitimacy, a tradition that medieval lords leaned into without question. The collapse of central authority after Rome's fall didn't end slavery. It decentralized it, spreading it across kingdoms like a weed. In the 7th century, Irish monks raided Britain for captives, selling them to Anglo-Saxon lords. In the 9th century, Viking raids fed slave markets from Dublin to Constantinople, their longships heavy with human cargo. The system was global in its reach, if not its name, linking Europe's manners to the wider world through chains. The economy of the early Middle Ages, from the wheat fields of Francia to the vineyards of Iberia, was built on this labor. a truth as unyielding as the stone it raised. What's sobering is how the system thrived on acceptance. Nobles saw slaves as wealth, not people. Peasants saw them as a grim reminder of their own precarious freedom. The church, for all its talk of souls, saw them as tools for God's work. Even slaves themselves, born into chains, often saw no other way. The feudal order was a pyramid, and slaves were its base, crushed under the weight of everyone above. Yet their endurance was a kind of rebellion, not with swords, but with survival, a quiet defiance that kept the world turning, even as it tried to erase them. We might look back and shudder, but let's not pretend we're above it. Our world still profits from exploitation, just dressed in shinier clothes. As we close this chapter, consider the legacy. Medieval slavery wasn't a footnote. It was the foundation, a system that shaped Europe's economy, laws, and soul. The slaves who toiled in anonymity built the world we inherit, their lives a debt we can't repay. Their resilience and their refusal to vanish is a story worth telling, not for pity, but for awe. They didn't change the system, but they survived it, and in that survival, they wrote a history of strength, one unrecorded but undeniable. Today, we live in a world of choices, but their world had none, and still, they carried on, a whisper across centuries. To live is to endure, even when the world says you're nothing. In the dim glow of medieval Europe's cathedrals, where crosses gleamed and sermons echoed, slavery thrived, not as a sin, but as a sacrament of the social order. By the early Middle Ages, Christianity had draped its mantle over the continent, shaping laws, lives, and consciences, yet it offered no reprieve to the enslaved, whose chains clinked in the shadow of the cross. From the 5th to the 11th centuries, slaves, nameless, voiceless, were the unseen muscle of a Christian society that saw their suffering not as injustice, but as divine design. They toiled in fields, stables, and monasteries, their lives a currency for the wealth of lords and the glory of God. Far from challenging this system, the church wove it into its doctrine, its monasteries owning slaves, and its canon law blessing their bondage. It was a world where faith and cruelty coexisted, as natural as the mud under a peasant's boot. The roots of this paradox lie in Rome's fading days, when Christianity rose as the empire fell. The early church, born in persecution, had little power to reshape society's foundations, including slavery, a practice as old as conquest itself. By the 4th century, as Constantine embraced the cross, slavery was entrenched, its machinery humming in villas and mines. The church adapted, not resisted. St. Augustine, a towering voice of the 5th century, argued that slavery was a consequence of sin, a divine punishment for humanity's fall. To free a slave might be charity, but to keep one was no sin. It was order, God's will etched into the hierarchy of the world. This theology, as cold as a winter dawn, gave masters a holy excuse to tighten their grip, their whips swinging with righteous certainty. Fast forward to the 8th century, and the church was no longer a fledgling sect, but a colossus, its monasteries dotting Europe like stars in a dark sky. These bastions of prayer and learning were also economic hubs, their fields and workshops powered by slaves. In Anglo-Saxon England, monasteries like Wearmouth Jarrow owned dozens, their labor tithing to God's glory. In Francia, under Charlemagne's iron rule, abbeys swelled with captives from Saxon wars, their toil a sacred offering. The church didn't just tolerate slavery, it profited. its ledgers listing human beings alongside cattle and plows. Canon law, the church's legal backbone, permitted the enslavement of non-Christians, pagans, Muslims, Jews, and those taken in just wars, a loophole wide enough to swallow entire tribes. It was a system sanctified, not questioned, its cruelty cloaked in scripture. Picture a 10th century manor, its chapel's bell tolling as slaves trudge to the fields. The Lord, fresh from Mass, counts his wealth in bodies, not coins. His slaves, born to chains or captured in raids, are as fixed as the seasons, men, women, children, their lives a cycle of toil and hunger. The priest, preaching obedience, sees their scars but speaks of souls, not suffering. The law, a blend of Roman codes and Christian edicts, offers no escape. The Council of Koblenz in 1922, for instance, ruled that slaves who fled could be hunted like stray dogs, their freedom a theft against God's order. Punishment was swift, lashes, branding, or worse, meted out in the churchyard, where the cross cast its shadow over the whip. It was a world where faith justified everything, and slaves paid the price. What's jarring is the scale. By 1086, the Domesday Book, William the Conqueror's Great Survey of England, recorded roughly 10% of the population, tens of thousands, as slaves, their lives erased in ink beside livestock. They were inherited, sold, or gifted, their status as fixed as stone. A noble might bequeath a slave to a monastery, their labor a donation to heaven. A bishop might trade one for a horse, their worth measured in barter. In the Byzantine Empire, the church's eastern arm, slaves rode galleys and worked estates, their numbers fed by wars against Slavs and Bulgars. Even in smaller realms, like Visigothic Spain, slaves were a fixture, their bondage blessed by councils that saw no contradiction in praying for souls while chaining bodies. It was a system so woven into life that no one blinked. Compare this to today, where we champion human rights and wince at history's cruelties, yet still grapple with exploitation, modern slavery in sweatshops, trafficking, and forced labor. We have laws, NGOs, and hashtags, but the medieval world had none, only a church that saw slavery as God's plan, not a moral failing. We might smugly claim progress, but let's not kid ourselves. The indifference that lets slaves toil under crosses mirrors our own blind spots, where convenience often trumps conscience. The slaves' endurance, their ability to survive a world that sanctified their suffering, is a humbling mirror. They didn't have the luxury of outrage, yet they carried on, their resilience a quiet rebuke to a system that tried to erase them. Let's dig into the mechanics. Slaves weren't just war captives, they were a self-perpetuating class. Children born to slaves inherited their chains, a cycle unbroken across generations. Free folk could fall into bondage through debt, crime, or marriage to a slave, their freedom a fragile thread easily snapped. The church's laws were merciless. In 7th century Spain, the Visigothic code allowed masters to mutilate or kill slaves for defiance, their suffering a legal footnote. In Anglo-Saxon England, a free woman who bore a slave's child could lose her status, her life, and her offspring chained to the manor. The church didn't just permit this, it enforced it, its courts upholding masters' rights. The Council of Epaon in 517, for example, banned freeing slaves without a master's consent, ensuring the system's grip tightened with holy sanction. What's chilling is the silence in the records. Medieval chronicles, brimming with tales of saints and kings, rarely mention slaves, as if their lives were too small to matter. When they do, it's in passing, a note on a monastery's wealth, a ruling on their punishment. The Lindisfarne Gospels, a masterpiece of 8th century art, were crafted in a monastery by slaves, their labor invisible behind the illuminated pages. Yet their toil was the foundation of everything: the bread that fed monks, the stone that built churches, the wool that clothed bishops. Without slaves, the Christian world would have faltered, its prayers unanswered, its altars bare. They were the unseen pillars, their suffering a sacrifice no one acknowledged, but everyone relied on. Let's reflect on the human cost. Imagine a slave, her hands cracked from grinding grain, her back scarred from the whip, waking each day to a life that offered no hope. She didn't dream of freedom. Freedom was a word for others. She worked, ate, slept, and died, her life a cycle of survival no one recorded. The church told her suffering was divine. The law told her she was nothing. Yet she endured not with rebellion, but with a stubborn will that carried her through decades of toil. We might call it strength, but she wouldn't. She'd call it life, and she lived it day by day, a testament to a resilience we can barely fathom. Today, we seek meaning in faith or purpose, but she found it in simply being, in refusing to break under a system that expected her to. The broader picture is no less grim. The church's embrace of slavery wasn't a flaw, but a feature, a way to align spiritual authority with earthly power. Bishops and abbots, as landowners, depended on slave labor to fund their missions, and their piety was built on human suffering. The 9th century Synod of Melfi, for instance, allowed clergy to own slaves, their bondage a practical necessity for God's work. In the East, the Byzantine Church justified enslaving Muslims and pagans, their labor a spoil of holy wars. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was logic, a world where faith and power were one, and slaves were the currency that bound them. The economy of Christian Europe, from the vineyards of Italy to the fisheries of England, rested on this labor, a truth as unyielding as the stone of its cathedrals. What's sobering is the legacy. The Church's sanction of slavery shaped medieval society, embedding a hierarchy that lingered long after the chains were struck. The slaves, who toiled in anonymity, built the world we inherit, their lives a debt we can't repay. Their resilience, their refusal to vanish, is a story worth telling, not for pity, but for awe. They didn't change the system, but they survived it, and in that survival, they wrote a history of strength, one unrecorded but undeniable. Today, we live in a world of choices, but their world had none, and still they carried on, a whisper across centuries. To live is to endure, even when the world says you're nothing. In the shimmering waters of the Mediterranean, where trade routes wove a tapestry of commerce and conquest, the medieval slave trade pulsed like a dark heartbeat, binding Christian Europe to the Islamic world in a grim exchange of human lives. From the 8th to the 11th centuries, this sea was no mere boundary, but a highway, ferrying captives, often Slavs from Eastern Europe, across its waves to markets in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo. These men, women, and children, stripped of freedom and names, were not just labor, but currency, traded for gold, spices, and silks that fueled Europe's nascent economies. The term slave, etched into history's ledger, owes its name to these Slavic peoples, whose suffering became so synonymous with bondage that it birthed a word still heavy with pain. It was a trade as brutal as it was banal, a machine of profit that turned souls into chattel under the Mediterranean's indifferent sun. The origins of this trade, trace back to the collapse of Rome, when Europe's fragmented kingdoms sought wealth in a world reshaped by Islam's rise. By the 7th century, the Umayyad Caliphate stretched from Spain to Persia, its markets hungry for labor to build cities, tend fields, and serve palaces. Europe, splintered into warring tribes and kingdoms, had no shortage of captives to supply. Viking longships, slicing through northern rivers, raided Slavic villages, dragging men and women to ports like Dublin and Rouen. From there, Italian merchants, Venetians, Genoese, Amalfitans ferried them across the sea, their galleys heavy with human cargo. The trade was a lifeline for both sides. Muslim rulers gained workers, soldiers, and concubines. European lords gained gold, their coffers swelling with the profits of misery. It was commerce, not conquest, but its cost was measured in lives. What's striking is the scale. By the 9th century, the slave trade was a cornerstone of Mediterranean exchange, its roots as fixed as the stars. In Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire's bustling hub, Slavic captives were sold alongside spices and silk, their lives priced like goods. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, absorbed thousands, using them as laborers, guards, or harem attendants. In Al-Andalus, Muslim-ruled Spain, slaves from Europe worked vineyards and built mosques, their labor a silent foundation for Cordoba's golden age. The numbers are murky. Chronicles rarely tallied human cargo, but estimates suggest tens of thousands crossed the sea each century, their journeys marked by chains and despair. The trade wasn't a secret, it was a system, as routine as the tides, its cruelty cloaked in the banality of profit. Picture a port in 10th century Venice, its docks alive with the creak of ships and the shouts of merchants. A Slavic captive, his wrists bound, steps off a galley, his eyes squinting against the sun. He might have been a farmer, a father, a son, but now he's a commodity, his worth haggled over in a tongue he doesn't understand. The merchant, his purse heavy with dinars, counts his profit, indifferent to the man's past or pain. Across the sea, in a Baghdad bazaar, another slave, a woman perhaps, stands in a market, her future bartered between men in silk robes. The air smells of salt, sweat, and spice, but for her, it's the stench of loss. These scenes played out endlessly, from Lisbon to Damascus, a trade that stitched continents together with chains, its rhythm as steady as the waves. Let's ground this in history. The term slave emerged from Slav in the 9th century, a linguistic scar from the relentless raids on Eastern Europe. The Carolingian Empire, under Charlemagne, waged wars against Slavic tribes, flooding markets with captives. The Vikings, masters of the raid, swept through Poland and Russia, their longships delivering thousands to Byzantine and Muslim buyers. The Domesday Book of 1086, while focused on England, hints at the broader system, listing slaves as property in a world where human bondage was unremarkable. In Islamic markets, slaves were versatile, soldiers in the caliph's guard, laborers in fields, or concubines in harems, each role a grim testament to their value. Europe, in turn, imported wealth, gold from Mali, silks from China, and spices from India, all paid for with human lives. Compare this to today, where we condemn trafficking yet turn a blind eye to its modern forms: sweatshops, forced labor, and exploitation hidden in global supply chains. The medieval slave trade was raw and unapologetic. Its victims were paraded in open markets, not tucked away in factories. We have laws, watchdogs, and hashtags, but the impulse to profit from suffering lingers, dressed in subtler clothes. The slaves of the Mediterranean, their lives traded for gold, remind us of our own blind spots, where convenience often trumps conscience. Their resilience, their ability to survive a journey across seas and into bondage, is a mirror we might hesitate to face. They didn't choose their fate, yet they endured, their lives a quiet defiance against a world that saw them as goods. Let's dig deeper into the mechanics. The trade wasn't random, it was a system, with roots and roles as defined as any guild. Vikings raided, Italians shipped, and Muslims bought, a chain of supply and demand that spanned continents. In the 9th century, the Rhodanite merchants, Jewish traders bridging east and west, played a key role, ferrying slaves alongside silk and amber. The Byzantine Empire taxed the trade, its bureaucrats noting human cargo with the same indifference as grain. In Al-Andalus, the Umayyad rulers set prices, so a healthy male might fetch 20 dinars, a woman less, a child barely worth the coin. The law, whether Christian or Muslim, upheld the trade. The church, preaching salvation, saw no sin in selling pagans or captives, while Islamic law permitted the enslavement of non-Muslims, a symmetry of indifference that bound both worlds. What's chilling is the silence in the records. Medieval chronicles, brimming with tales of caliphs and kings, rarely linger on the slaves, their lives a footnote in the saga of empires. When they appear, it's in passing, a merchant's ledger, a tax record, a legal ruling on their sale. The 10th century Book of Roots and Realms by Arab geographer Ibn Hawqal mentions slave markets in passing as if they were as mundane as grain stalls. Yet their labor was the backbone of both worlds. The mosques of Cordoba, the palaces of Baghdad, the manors of Francia, all built on the sweat of those who had no voice. They were the unseen engine, their suffering a currency no one questioned, but everyone spent. Let's reflect on the human cost. Imagine a Slavic woman, torn from her village, her wrist chafed by rope, herded onto a ship bound for a foreign shore. She didn't dream of escape. Escape was a myth, the sea a wall. She worked, served, and survived her life in a cycle of labor no one recorded. The law, whether Christian or Muslim, saw her as property. The market saw her as profit. Yet she endured not with rebellion, but with a stubborn will that carried her through years of bondage. We might call it strength, but she wouldn't. She'd call it life, and she lived it day by day, a testament to a resilience we can barely fathom. Today, we seek meaning in freedom or purpose, but she found it in simply being, in refusing to break under a system that traded her like a coin. The broader picture is no less grim. The Mediterranean slave trade wasn't a sideshow. It was a pillar, linking Europe's feudal manners to the Islamic world's golden cities. The wealth it brought, gold, silk, spices, fueled economies, from Venice's rise to Charlemagne's empire. The slaves, their lives spent in fields or harems, were the price. Their suffering was a silent foundation for progress. The trade's legacy lingers in the word slave, a scar on the language itself, and in the economies it enriched, whose echoes shape our world. The slave's endurance, their refusal to vanish, is a story worth telling, not for pity, but for awe. They didn't change the system, but they survived it, and in that survival, they wrote a history of strength, one unrecorded but undeniable. Today, we live in a world of choices, but their world had none, and still they carried on, a whisper across centuries. To live is to endure, even when the world trades you away. As Europe's sails unfurled across uncharted seas in the 15th century, the age of exploration birthed a new, brutal chapter in the saga of slavery, one that stretched chains across oceans and continents. The Mediterranean's grim trade, once a regional pulse, gave way to a global machine, with Portugal and Spain as its architects, forging the transatlantic slave trade that would scar the world for centuries. From the shores of West Africa to the plantations of the Americas, millions were torn from their homes, packed into ships like cargo, and their lives traded for sugar, tobacco, and rum. This wasn't just commerce. It was a calculated theft of humanity, a system that turned souls into profit under the guise of progress. The Atlantic, a vast blue graveyard, bore witness to a trade so vast, so cruel, it reshaped empires, economies, and the very idea of what it meant to be human. The seeds of this era were sown when Portugal, in the 1440s, began probing Africa's coast, seeking gold and spices, but finding a darker treasure, human lives. Prince Henry the Navigator, less a hero than a profiteer, sponsored voyages that brought the first African captives to Lisbon by 1444, their arrival a spark that ignited a monstrous trade. By the late 15th century, as Columbus stumbled onto the Americas, Spain joined the fray, its colonies hungry for labor to mine silver and grow cane. The transatlantic slave trade, born in these early ventures, became a machine of staggering efficiency. Portuguese and Spanish ships, later joined by the Dutch, English, and French, hauled millions, estimates range from 12 to 15 million, across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th centuries, their suffering the fuel for Europe's colonial dreams. What's staggering is the brutality baked into the system. The Middle Passage, the sea journey from Africa to the Americas, was a floating hell. Captives, chained below decks, endured conditions that defy comprehension. Cramped, airless holds where disease and despair claimed up to 1 in 5. The stench of sweat, blood, and fear clung to the ships, their creaking timbers a dirge for the lost. Survivors faced plantations in Brazil, the Caribbean, or North America, where their labor turned jungles into fields of sugar and cotton. The triangular trade was the engine. Ships carried slaves to the Americas, loaded crops for Europe, and returned to Africa with goods to barter for more captives. It was a cycle of profit, oiled by misery, that enriched Lisbon, London, and Seville while devastating African societies. Picture a 16th century port in Lisbon, its docks a chaos of ropes, barrels, and human cargo. An African man, wrist-bound, steps off a caravel, his eyes hollow from weeks at sea. He might have been a farmer, a warrior, a father, but now he's a commodity, his worth tallied in reals or escudos. Across the ocean, in a Brazilian sugar plantation, another captive, a woman, cuts cane under a blistering sun, her hands bleeding, her life measured in bushels. The overseer's whip cracks, a sound as constant as the cicadas. These scenes, repeated across centuries, were the backbone of the New World's economy, from the mines of Potosi to the fields of Virginia. The slaves' labor built empires, their suffering a silent tax paid to Europe's ambition. Let's ground this in history. By the 1500s, Portugal dominated the trade, its forts along Africa's Gold Coast, like Elmina, built in 1482, serving as grim warehouses for human lives. Spain, with its vast American colonies, followed closely, its encomienda system enslaving both Africans and indigenous peoples. The 1518 Asiento, a Spanish contract granting slave trading rights, formalized the trade, turning it into a state-sanctioned enterprise. By the 17th century, the English and Dutch muscled in, There are companies like the Royal African Company profiting from the same misery. The numbers are numbing. Brazil alone received over 4 million slaves, the Caribbean nearly as many, and North America about 400,000. African kingdoms like Dahomey and Ashanti were complicit, trading captives for guns and goods, their own societies fractured by the demand. Compare this to today, where we condemn human trafficking yet rely on global supply chains that often hide exploitation, sweatshops, child labor, and modern slavery in plain sight. The transatlantic trade was bolder, its cruelty unmasked, its victims paraded in ports and plantations. We have laws, NGOs, and campaigns, but the medieval and early modern worlds had no such qualms. Slavery was progress, a means to build empires and fill coffers. The resilience of those who survived the Middle Passage, who endured plantations with no hope of freedom, is a mirror we might shy from. They didn't choose their fate, yet they lived, their strength a quiet rebuke to a world that saw them as less than human. We might pat ourselves on the back for progress, but their scars remind us how thin that progress can be. Let's dig into the mechanics. The trade was a machine, its parts ruthlessly efficient. African captives, often taken in wars or raids fueled by European demand, were marched to coastal forts, their families shattered. At ports like Gorée or Cape Coast, they were inspected like livestock, teeth checked, limbs prodded, before being packed into ships. The Middle Passage could last 6 to 12 weeks, with mortality rates soaring from dysentery, smallpox, or despair-driven suicides. Survivors faced auctions in places like Charleston or Salvador, their lives sold to the highest bidder. On plantations, they worked 16-hour days, their bodies breaking under the whip and the sun. The system was designed to maximize profit, not mercy. Its cruelty was a feature, not a flaw, ensuring Europe's wealth grew with every ship that sailed. What's chilling is the silence in the records. European chronicles of the era, brimming with tales of explorers like Vasco da Gama or Cortés, rarely dwell on the slaves, their lives a footnote in the saga of empire. When they appear, it's in ledgers, a ship's manifest, a plantation's tally, a merchant's profit. The 1625 Journal of a Dutch Trader, for instance, lists 200 Negroes alongside sugar and rum, their humanity erased in ink. Yet their labor was the foundation of everything. The sugar that sweetened Europe's tea, the tobacco that filled its pipes, the silver that adorned its churches. Without slaves, the age of exploration would have faltered and its ambitions starved. They were the unseen engine, their suffering a currency no one questioned, but everyone spent. Let's reflect on the human cost. Imagine a young man, stolen from a Senegalese village, his wrists raw from chains, his eyes fixed on a horizon he'll never reach. He didn't dream of escape. The ocean was a wall, the plantation a prison. He worked, bled, survived, his life a cycle of labor no one recorded. The law saw him as property. The market saw him as profit. Yet he endured not with rebellion, but with a stubborn will that carried him through decades of bondage. We might call it strength, but he wouldn't. He'd call it life, and he lived it day by day, a testament to a resilience we can barely fathom. Today, we seek meaning in freedom or purpose, but he found it in simply being, in refusing to break under a system that traded him like a coin. The broader picture is no less grim. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't a sideshow. It was the backbone of the modern world, linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a triangle of exploitation. The wealth it brought, sugar, cotton, Silver fueled Europe's rise, from Lisbon's docks to London's banks. The slaves, their lives spent in mines or fields, were the price. Their suffering was a silent foundation for progress. The trade's legacy lingers in the Americas' racial divides, in Africa's fractured societies, and in the wealth gaps that persist. The slaves' endurance, their refusal to vanish, is a story worth telling, not for pity, but for awe. They didn't change the system, but they survived it, and in that survival, they wrote a history of strength, one unrecorded but undeniable. Today, we live in a world of choices, but their world had none, and still they carried on, a whisper across centuries. To live is to endure, even when the world trades you away. In the twilight of the 18th century, as Europe's empires fattened on the spoils of slavery, a quiet tremor began to shake the chains that bound millions, a movement to end the transatlantic trade, born not from sudden mercy, but from a slow burn of conscience, rebellion, and reason. The abolition movement, rising like a tide across the Atlantic, was no single spark, but a convergence of Enlightenment ideals, humanitarian cries, and the defiant voices of the enslaved themselves, who refused to let their suffering be silent. From smoky London taverns to the blood-soaked fields of Haiti, the call to end slavery grew, not as a chorus but as a cacophony, its echoes dismantling a system that had seemed as eternal as the sea. It was a fight not just for freedom, but for the soul of a world waking to its own cruelty, a battle won in increments, paid for in lives. The seeds of abolition sprouted in the late 1700s, when Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau began to question the moral rot of a system that traded humans like cattle. Their words, sharp as quills, pierced the comfortable indifference of Europe's elite, arguing that liberty was a universal right, not a privilege for the pale. In Britain, Quakers and evangelicals, like William Wilberforce, turned moral outrage into political pressure, their pamphlets flooding parlors with tales of the Middle Passage's horrors. By 1787, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was born, its members tireless in their campaign to shame a nation into action. Yet it was the enslaved who lit the fuse. Revolts like the 1739 Stono Rebellion in South Carolina or the 1791 Haitian Revolution, led by Toussaint Louverture, proved that freedom wasn't just a philosopher's dream, but a fire in the hearts of those in chains. What's striking is the resistance this movement faced. Slavery wasn't just a practice, it was an empire. Its roots sunk deep into the sugar fields of Jamaica, the cotton plantations of Virginia, and the gold mines of Brazil. Merchants in Liverpool and Lisbon, their coffers swollen with slave trade profits, fought tooth and nail to keep the system intact. Politicians, too, dragged their feet. Britain's parliament debated abolition for 2 decades before acting, yet the tide turned. In 1807, Britain banned the slave trade, and its navy patrolled the Atlantic to seize as the slave ships. By 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act freed nearly 800,000 souls across the British Empire, though freedom often meant poverty and new forms of coercion. France, slower to act, abolished slavery in 1794 amid the Revolution, only for Napoleon to reinstate it in 1802, a grim reminder of how fragile progress could be. It wasn't until 1848 that France fully freed its colony's slaves. Picture a London meeting hall in 1789, its air thick with tobacco and fervor. Abolitionists like Thomas Clarkson unfurl maps of slave ships, their diagrams showing bodies packed like firewood, while former slaves like Olaudah Equiano recount their horrors to hushed crowds. Across the ocean, in Haiti, the night burns with rebellion as enslaved men and women torch plantations, their machetes a demand for dignity. These scenes are disparate yet linked, were the movement's heartbeat, a blend of words and blood that forced the world to listen. In the Americas, slave revolts, Nat Turner's in 1831, or the 1811 German Coast Uprising, kept the pressure on, proving that the enslaved were not passive victims, but agents of their own liberation. It was a fight that crossed borders, uniting voices from Paris to Philadelphia, each one chipping at the system's foundations. Let's ground this in history. Britain's 1807 ban was a landmark, but it didn't end slavery, only the trade. The 1833 Act, costing the government $20 million to compensate slave owners, freed slaves but tied many to apprenticeships, a softer cage. France's 1794 abolition, spurred by the Revolution's ideals, was undone by Napoleon's greed, only to be restored in 1848 and after relentless pressure from activists like Victor Schulcher. The United States, fractured by its own contradictions, abolished slavery in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, a victory born from the Civil War's carnage and the courage of figures like Frederick Douglass. Brazil, the last Western holdout, freed its slaves in 1888 with the Golden Law, a belated nod to a world that had moved on. Haiti's 1804 revolution, a triumph of slave resistance, stood as a beacon, proving freedom could be seized, not just granted. Compare this to today, where we celebrate human rights, yet wrestle with their uneven application, modern slavery in factories, trafficking in shadows, and inequalities rooted in history's scars. The abolitionist fight feels distant, but its echoes linger. We have petitions, protests, and platforms, but they have quills, courage, and the audacity to challenge empires. The enslaved, whose revolts fueled the movement, remind us that change often comes from below, not above. Their resilience, their refusal to be silenced, is a mirror to our own struggles, where progress is hard-won and never guaranteed. We might smugly claim enlightenment, but the fight for justice remains, its roots in those who dared to say no to a world that said they were nothing. What's sobering is the cost. Abolition wasn't a clean victory. It was a slog, paid for in blood and betrayal. Enslaved rebels faced execution, their uprisings crushed with savage precision. Activists like Wilberforce endured death threats. Equiano faced racism, even as he spoke. The freed often found freedom hollow, landless and penniless. They traded chains for new burdens. In Britain, slave owners were compensated, not slaves, a bitter irony that favored profit over justice. In the Americas, emancipation often meant sharecropping or wage slavery, systems that mimicked bondage in all but name. Yet the movement's triumph was real. Millions walked free, their descendants shaping the world we know. It was a victory of will, a testament to those who fought when the odds were a mountain. Let's reflect on the legacy. The abolition movement wasn't just about ending slavery. It was about redefining humanity, about insisting that no one should be property. It was messy and incomplete, but it shifted the world's moral compass, planting seeds that grew into modern human rights. The enslaved, whose voices fueled the fight, were its true architects, their courage a whisper that roared across centuries. Today, we live in a world shaped by their struggle, where freedom is a right, not a gift, but their scars remind us how fragile that right can be. Their endurance, their refusal to vanish, is a story worth telling, not for pity, but for awe. They didn't just survive, they changed the world. a truth that lingers as we chase our own justice, a whisper across time. To fight is to live, even when the world says you shouldn't. In the fading echoes of the abolition movement, as chains were struck and ledgers of human lives closed, the scars of slavery lingered like shadows cast by a dying fire. The transatlantic slave trade, dismantled by the late 19th century, left behind not just freedom, but a fractured world, its wounds etched into the economies, societies, and souls of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. From the 15th to the 19th centuries, millions had been torn from their homes, their labor-fueling empires, while their humanity was erased. When the laws finally changed, Britain in 1833, the United States in 1865, and Brazil in 1888, the freed stepped into a world that offered liberty in name but rarely in substance. The legacy of slavery wasn't just a historical artifact, it was a living wound, shaping racial divides, economic gaps, and social hierarchies that persist like ghosts in our modern age. The immediate aftermath was a bitter irony. Freed slaves, their chains broken, often found themselves bound by new shackles, poverty, landlessness, and systems designed to keep them down. In the Americas, sharecropping and debt peonage replaced plantations, tying former slaves to the same fields under a different name. In the United States, the 13th Amendment freed millions, but Jim Crow laws and lynchings ensured their freedom was a cage of fear and exclusion. In Brazil, the Golden Law of 1888 ended slavery, but left freedmen in slums, their labor swapped for wages barely enough to survive. In Africa, the trade's devastation lingered, communities fractured, economies warped by centuries of raids and complicity. Europe, enriched by the trade, turned a blind eye, its cities gleaming with wealth built on suffering. It was progress, but progress with a smirk, offering freedom while withholding justice. What's chilling is how deeply these scars ran. The wealth of colonial powers, Britain, Spain, Portugal, was built on slave labor, from the sugar that sweetened London's tea to the silver that adorned Madrid's churches. This capital funded industrial revolutions, but for the freed, there was no share in the spoils. Racial hierarchies, born in the trade's logic of dehumanization, hardened into systems of segregation and discrimination. In the Americas, skin color became a sentence, dictating who could vote, own land, or walk without fear. In Africa, colonial borders, drawn with little regard for tribal ties, sowed chaos that echoes in modern conflicts. The slave trade didn't just steal lives, it reshaped continents, its fingerprints on everything from wealth gaps to cultural rifts, a legacy as stubborn as the chains it broke. Picture a freed woman in 1866 Georgia, her hands still calloused from cotton fields, now working the same land as a sharecropper, her debt to the landowner a new kind of chain. Or a village in Senegal, its youth drained by centuries of raids, struggling to rebuild under colonial rule. These were not isolated stories, but a global tapestry of loss, woven from the threads of a trade that saw humans as profit. The Domesday Book of 1086 had listed slaves as property. Centuries later, the mindset lingered, treating the freed as less than equal. The law might have changed, but society's heart was slower, its prejudices a shadow that stretched across generations, a reminder that freedom on paper is not freedom in life. Compare this to today, where we tout equality yet grapple with its ghosts, racial profiling, economic disparity, and systemic bias. The slave trade's legacy is not a dusty history lesson. It's in the wealth gaps we see, the stereotypes we fight, the protests we march. We have rights, laws, and platforms, but the echoes of slavery remind us how fragile they are. The resilience of the free, who built lives from ashes despite every barrier, is a humbling mirror. They didn't just survive, they laid the groundwork for the struggles we continue. Their courage a whisper that demands we keep pushing. We might call it progress, but they'd call it survival, a lesson in endurance we do well to heed. Let's reflect on the cost. The slaves, whose labor built empires, left a legacy not just of pain, but of strength. Their descendants, fighting for rights in the face of systemic odds, carried that torch. The abolition movement, fueled by their revolts and voices, was a triumph, but an incomplete one. It taught us that change is possible, but never easy, and that justice is a debt still unpaid. Their story, recorded in ledgers but undeniable in history, is a call to remember, not to wallow, but to learn, to ensure the past doesn't repeat in new disguises. Today, we live in a world shaped by their struggle, where freedom is a right, not a gift, and their endurance whispers across centuries. To live is to fight, even when the world tries to forget you. And so, we drift from the shadowed chains of medieval slaves, through centuries of toil and triumph, to rest here in the quiet of your night. The manners fade, the whips fall silent, but their whispers linger, a tale of endurance, of lives that shaped our world. Let your shoulders soften, your breath slow, as the hum of history cradles you. If you're still awake, share a thought below. Where did this journey take you? For now, let the stars keep watch, the night wrap you gently. Tomorrow, another story waits, ready to unfold under the same moon. Close your eyes, let the past dissolve, and slip into dreams softer than this world once was. Good night.